All right, so Maya, quick introduction. Maya is an online retail business. It's a husband and wife team. They came out of the Nest.io startup. They are also a mentee of ours. And what they do is they focus on the baby, mother care, and preteen market, where they supply products to families, mothers, parents, and um, customers in essentially all across Pakistan. Their thesis is very simple. Sabine, who's the co-founder, her take was that uh, why do I have to pick up products that I don't like in Karachi? Why can't I just get good quality stuff? So she and her husband Altamash, they came from a retailing background. They put together a supply chain. They curated products from vendors in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, China, and started an online store. And from the context of our case, at the point that we are standing right now, the big question that we have is how or why or which direction would Maya grow in, and what options for scaling up do they have? Now, from a timing point of view, there is an interesting twist. The twist is that you're standing in February 2020. So you're about a year and a half behind. You're seeing news coming out of everywhere around this pandemic. Maya and Altamash have exposure to China because a large number of their supplies are in China. And they have a couple of questions. Their first big question is, how serious is this? And how do we forecast? How do we predict? How do we handle growth assumptions for 2020 and 2021? And the reason why this question is important, in Feb 2020, so when you look at the numbers on the in the case and in the data set, you'll find that Maya sort of works in a seasonal fashion, right? So they have 5 really good months, and 3 of those 5 good months are March, April, May, and then the next 2 are September and October, and then December is also a big one. So they need to plan their purchasing. They need to plan how much they order, what products they order, essentially in the Jan-Feb timeframe. And if they don't plan it, they don't order it, then and it doesn't get shipped, then it's not possible for them to fulfill. So the big question for them in February 2020 is, given the pandemic, how do we approach the modeling question? That's number one. Second question that Maya is facing is that they've been very keen on exploring Dubai or UAE as an additional market, as a secondary market, and their growth model is, why don't we set up or buy a warehouse? So right now what happens is they place an order, and the order is essentially in the warehouse of their Chinese or their Thailand or their Vietnamese vendor, and then they have to manage logistics. So their take is, rather than sort of shipping smaller orders, why don't we just ship everything in one go from our vendors to our big warehouse in Dubai, and then use that warehouse to explore, expand in the UAE market, and also support the Pakistan business. So the second big question is, one question is growth. What does growth look like for 2020, 2021? The second big question is, what is the mechanic? What is the cost? What does the efficiencies associated with the warehouse in Dubai look like? So these are the 2 primary questions: growth in pandemic and the warehouse question. And that's the question we're going to answer. If you don't have a lot of data, if you only have the news you have visible in Feb 2020, how would you approach the growth question for Maya? Where would you start? As in, we all faced this last year, right? We all faced this in the Feb-March time frame, when we were looking at how what the news coming out was going to affect our businesses, impact our businesses. So where would you start? If you were in Maya's case, if you were sitting in or wearing Sabine and Altamish's shoes, how would you advise them? What would you say to them? So in Maya's case, we have a data set, and this data set shows us the number of orders, and it shows us in two forms. One, it gives us the progression on a month by month basis, right? So Jan 2015, Jan 2016, 17, 18 and 19, and we can clearly see that the numbers are growing. And there also shows us numbers on a year by year basis, right? So if we have these two figures available, what we want to think about, the question we want to answer is, if we had this data of orders, and I've intentionally kept away the revenue question because that's something that we'll use on the modeling side. But if you're just looking at orders, if you're just looking at the historical trend of orders, and you had this data for 2019, and I said, your January number was just a little lower than December. So let's say it was maybe about 1,000 orders, maybe about 980 orders. Maybe let's say your February orders were also about 1,000 orders. What would March look like? So now the question I'm asking is a slightly different question. I'm not asking what would 2020 look like. I'm saying, let's start with March. What's our outlook for March? How would we forecast number of orders for March 2020? Given this trend, given this data set, and the fact that we have access to January and February orders. So one answer, this is a very valid answer, is that you have historical data, but that historical data does not include the impact of the pandemic. That's one. It's not the only thing that's available to you, right? Remember, you're also exploring, as mentioned earlier, you're also exploring the options, the possibility of exploring UAE as a market. So you also have some data from UAE. So the cost of your warehouse, the industrial space that you want to pick, you're looking at a max investment of about $1 million dirhams, which is about, say, roughly about $300,000. And you have a budget, you have a way of sort of funding and financing it through a friends and family loan. You possibly looking at the option of maybe talking to a couple of banks. That may not be something possible right upfront, but if you have maybe a year and a half of history in the UAE market, then that may become a possibility. And again, you're saying, I have one question with respect to my growth in the Pakistani market. I have another question with respect to what does the UAE market look like? Is this the right time to expand to Dubai or not? More data. So you do a Google search and you come up with a couple of results and reports, and they show you the following trend. So they say, UAE e-commerce sales are likely to go up. So this was done in 2017, and the 2017 outlook says that by the time we get to 2020 and 2021, our number is going to be about $19.7 billion and $23.3 billion. Is this a good start for looking at the UAE market? Would you recommend it? Is it where you'd start? This is too broad. What does Maya sell? So if you narrow it down by category, what does that look like? Let's see if you have that data. So this is more recent, and this includes, so this is done in August 2020, and this includes the projected impact of pandemic, and it breaks this down by apparel, footwear, bags, and accessories. Do you think this works? Is this better? This is also growing, but within this, different categories are growing at very different rates. If you look at bags and accessories, this is the lowest piece. Then you have footwear, which is number 2, and then you have clothing. Is this better? Then you have a third data point, and this data point comes from Visa. It's a little dated, and this is also pre-pandemic, but this gives you a sense of what your typical cart looks like. So if you look at your average revenue per user on who's buying stuff using online stores, so an e-commerce shopper typically spends about $184. So this number here. There we go. This number here spent about $184 per order in 16 and 17. That became 163, and that became 144 by the time it came to February 2019. Is this a good metric? Sort of showing you that the odd or average order size per user is declining, right? It's sort of heading south. It's going this side. So we've got a couple of data points. We've got one data point here. We got this. So this is not usable, right? It's not usable. Why? Because it's too broad and it's too dated, right? This was done in 17. So I think one of the key things that happens, if you think in terms of how founders or how modelers sort of put together data, put together models, put together assumptions, one big source of that is you go out and look up what has been done in the past. You look at industry studies, statistics, but you need to be very careful. You can't take a broad segment. So you can't just take UAE e-commerce sale. That doesn't work. You have to be specific. This too is broad. It's better, but this too is also very broad. Then you got trends. You got a trend that's showing that things are heading downwards, but this is also dated in the sense this is pre-pandemic. Do we have any data post-pandemic? So this is from the same source that gave us the adjusted data set in August 2020. And this shows us that if you look at growth, your projected growth was about 40% and 37%, between 37 to 40% for the three categories. It's likely to slow down over the next 4 years, and the trend is clearly downwards from a growth point of view. So I think the second thing we want to remember and walk away, you want to sort of note this down, is that you might see a lot of exciting growth in your first couple of years, but things are likely to slow down. And that happens for a couple of reasons. When we actually dig into the model itself, we'll talk a bit about that. So that's two. This is the revenue per user post-pandemic. Do you see something interesting? So if you go back to the Visa figure, I think it was about $144, right? $150. $150 about 370 plus, say about 500 dirhams. If you see the data now, as per Statista, who ran the numbers, including the impact of the pandemic, their expectation was numbers are likely to go up. And did they go up or not is a separate question. What we are saying is, standing in Feb 2020, what's our expectation? How do we see things going? And we've got maybe three possible scenarios. Scenario number one, this will pass through in a month. And so these are the choices, these are the questions that Sabine and Altamash are asking themselves. Right? They're saying option number one, this will pass. So you've got about maybe disruption for about 3 to 6 weeks, 8 weeks at max, and then things will get back to normal. So that's our business as usual, a BAU scenario, right? Number one. Option number two is, despite the fact that there is a lot of hurt and there is a lot of disruption, the nature of the pandemic has driven shoppers online. So orders will explode. More people will prefer to buy stuff online than go to stores. And the reason why they prefer to buy online, multiple factors there. One is lockdown, one is restriction, one is just the fact I just don't want to take that risk of being out in an open space. So that's option number two. Option number three is the end of the world scenario, where this is going to be catastrophic closures and we will not see significant sales over the next 4 to 6 months. And 2020 as a year, from a sales point of view, from an orders point of view, from a growth point of view, is going to be a total disaster. So there are three scenarios. One is normal, things as usual, business as usual, BAU. Two is explosive growth. Three is catastrophe, right? Three scenarios. Now, the question we want to ask ourselves is, given the limitations of the data that we have available, is there anything that we can do that can help us get to the next stage? So if we move on to the next set of assumptions, you have to think in terms of, why are we so focused on orders? As in, I've asked, we're trying to get a sense of what's going to happen to orders, but why are we looking at orders? Remember I said, what's the right question to ask? So, A, what's the purpose of this exercise? Why are we doing this? We're trying to answer the growth question, right? But why is the growth question important? Focus on the question. Why is the growth question important? If Maya gets growth wrong, what's the worst that can happen? If they order too much and sales don't move, they're out of pocket for what they bought. If they order too less and sales explode, they will not be able to fulfill because they won't have inventory. And with the way things are going, they read right now where China is going to hit a lockdown, Vietnam is possibly going to hit a lockdown. So there's going to be a big disruption in supply chain point of view, right? And whoever has the inventory, whoever has stuff that they can ship, that they can fulfill, will have an advantage and an edge, right? That's the read. The question is, what's the likelihood of that happening, right? So in the model that they've built, right, their model is, because it's an online store, they're driven by impressions. So how many impressions do they get? On those impressions, what's the click-through rate? So, somebody sees an ad, somebody does a search, somebody does looks for a review for a product and ends up on Maya's site. So the people who end up on Maya's site, the question is, is the copy, are the visuals, are the images, are the testimonials compelling enough for them to convert into orders, and then orders times ticket size gives them the revenue, right? So this is the primary model. Impressions, stuff that you see online, either in terms of, so you search for baby shoes in Karachi, or you search for water bottles for schools in Karachi, or you search for onesies 6 months old, unisex, right? You search for that and something pops up. So you do a search on Google and Maya's site pops up, so you click on that, you get to the page, you see the page. Once you see the page, you like it, you place an order, and you buy, let's say, $50 worth of onesies, and that's your ticket size, and that one order contributes about $50. You get 100 such orders, that gives you $5,000 in sales, right? That's the model. Now, one of the questions that we've seen, so if you go back to the data set, one of the questions you've seen is, you can clearly see that even in the most recent year here in 2019, even in the most recent years, sales are not constant. So you got these 3 months here, which is March, April, May. And when I said, what's the question we're asking? Why are we asking the question? Because you are heading into what could be your strongest season in your history, March, April, May, if scenario B holds, if you'll be hit by explosive growth, or you might be heading to your worst possible 3 months in history, depending on what happens from pandemic point of view. So you've got these 3 months, and then right towards the end of the year, you get another spike in November and December. So your sales are seasonal, right? You're not too worried about June, July, August, September, October, but you want to make sure that you have enough inventory to fulfill your conventional business as usual or explosive growth if that comes up. When you present those numbers in a graphical fashion, you can see that this is clearly seasonal. So now, this is the first lesson that I want to emphasize. A lot of time, it's important for us to get to a crude answer quickly, rather than worry about the sophistication of a model. It's important to get a crude answer, even if it's a wrong answer, because what we want to do is we want to test through the thinking behind a model. So what's step number one? Step number one is we have orders data. What would be step number two? Can we use this data to forecast sales for March 2020? What would be step number three? Can we extend that forecast for all of 2020? right? This is the task. These are the questions that we want to answer. Now, what's the issue? The issue is there are lots of qualifications. What are the qualifications? What are the challenges? What are the problems in this approach? The first problem is historical data does not reflect the anticipated, expected pandemic experience. One. What's number two? The model that we will build will most likely season. How do you spell seasons? Seasonality. So seasonality, we need a model for modeling seasonality, right? So the sales, growth in sales, changes in sales, numbers in sales, right? We need to figure out how to manage that. So that's question number two. Challenge number three. Challenge number three is we have some probabilities. So ideally we want to get some sense of a distribution. We want some sense of a range of values with the likelihood. And our next exercise is to see if we can use the data Maya has shared with us to generate this. Now, the most important lesson here is whatever result we get will most likely be wrong. But we're not too worried about it. Why? Because for us, this is a thought experiment. We're using this to do a dry run on our thinking. And our approach and our mindset is, in order to do this dry run, we must start somewhere. As we do our first edition, as we do our first cut, we'll figure out everything that's wrong and we'll improve some of that. But let's get to that first cut. And then we'll do a second cut, a third cut, and a fourth cut till we get to the answer that works for us. So it's going to be an iterative approach. You won't get to an answer on the first pass.